Hello and welcome to the very first episode of The Point World Affairs. I'm Cha Sang-mi. On our program, we invite experts to shed light on one of the most prominent global political, economic, or cultural issues of the week. This week, we'll take a look at a possible trade war between Washington and Beijing. For today's discussion, we're joined by Shin Se-don, professor at the Department of Economics at Sookmyung Women's University. Thank you, Professor, for coming.
My pleasure.
Trade tensions are rising between the U.S. and China. U.S. President Donald Trump has vigorously advocated America First protectionism since taking office. Trump unveiled a 100-day plan to curb the bilateral trade imbalance with China in May 2017 and impose safeguard tariffs on Chinese solar panels and washing machines in January this year. On March 22nd, he signed a presidential memorandum to introduce a 25% tariff on Chinese goods worth $50 billion. Beijing hit back by announcing tariffs on 106 U.S. agricultural and industrial products worth $50 billion, including soybeans, automobiles, and airplanes. Tensions temporarily eased in May when the two countries decided to put on hold their plans to place tariffs on each other in a move to avert a tit-for-tat trade war. However, on May 29th, the White House said it will release the final list of Chinese goods that will be subject to a 25% tariff and will restrict Chinese investment in the U.S. and purchases of high-tech goods. A third round of U.S.-China trade negotiations ended in early June without a breakthrough, raising concerns of a possible trade war between the two superpowers. What is the main cause of their trade disputes? Trade volume between the two nations has grown in recent years, hitting roughly $580 billion in 2017. Last year, out of a total U.S. trade deficit of $796 billion, China amounted to a record 47% at $375 billion. The Trump administration cites China's high tariffs on U.S. products, restrictions on market access, and forced technology transfer as the main reasons for the trade imbalance. However, the U.S. economy is improving with its GDP growth expected to be in the 3% range this year for the first time in 13 years. Also, as the proposed U.S. tariffs mostly target advanced technology Chinese imports, some believe Washington's decision is a move to gain a competitive edge in high-tech areas. Meanwhile, Beijing's planned tariffs target farming and manufacturing, which could hit battleground states in the upcoming U.S. midterm elections. On this week's The Point World Affairs, we take a closer look into the simmering U.S.-China trade standoff and its implications.
So, Professor Shin, can you tell us where U.S. and China stand in terms of the trade disputes?
Well, ever since President Trump took office last year, he had ordered a series of investigations about illegal practices of the major trading partners who enjoys huge trade surplus. At the center of those major trading partners lies China, which is about 50% of trade surplus against the United States. And after a series of investigations concluded the last year, from the start of this year, America is beginning to impose a series of tariffs and restrictions against the Chinese imports. And so from January of this year until the end of April, there has been an exchange of very high tariffs against each other. And with this kind of a threat of escalating into a global trade war between the two countries, they decided to initiate a series of talks. And that started early May, the first meeting, and it was a failure. And in the middle of May, there was a second meeting between the two countries in Washington. In the meeting at Washington, started from 17th and 18th of May, China was apparently agreed to the demands for the United States in reducing the Chinese surplus against the United States, and also China pledged to kind of protect the American intellectual property rights. But there was no specific commitments, and unsatisfied with the specific commitments by the Chinese government, President Trump has initiated a kind of series of tariff after that, which is about 25% tariff on the intellectual products imported to the United States. So on the third meeting, which lasted about June 3rd and 4th, third talks between the two countries has actually failed in reaching an agreement. So series of talks between the two countries has been going on throughout the month of May and possibly June, but so far, mutually beneficial agreements has not reached yet.
You did mention that since the Trump administration came into office, this has been quite of an issue between the two superpowers. So do you think there's a possibility that this dispute can escalate into a trade war?
At the most, I think it's flexible. Actually, we understand that President Trump is expecting to face middle of November election, and that kind of evaluates his performances for the first 2 years, knowing that his kind of popularity has been decreasing ever since his inauguration. He has to make up on some critical issue. One of the critical issue may be the relationship with North Korea, and another, I think, quite important economic issue is to have a substantial kind of result or outcome in international trade deficit against other countries. So he wanted to show some kind of outcome before the November. So I think sooner or later, I think Trump administration is coming up with China with some mutually beneficial and agreeable solution. So by the end, I think, of November, I think the tension between the two countries will subside dramatically. But nobody knows, understanding the Trump's personality, unpredictability, well, we can't be sure. But I think the issue is pretty much political in the sense that Trump is kind of utilizing this issue. So I think a very slim chance of a trade war escalating into his entire term.
I see. So you're saying that the third meeting also failed, but still by November we can hope and expect that the trade tensions will die out.
Plenty of time, and both countries know that they have to avoid internecine trade war between the two countries because it's kind of mutually kind of devastating. So both countries know the potential threat of mutually escalating trade wars. So I think they are pretty smart to kind of close down the issue by I think the middle of November.
What would happen if Washington and Beijing impose tariffs on each other? The U.S. and China dominate the global market as the world's largest economies with a GDP of $19.3 trillion and $11.9 trillion US dollars respectively. Their combined GDP amounts to $31 trillion, or more than half of the world's GDP. Given the sheer size of their economies, a full-fledged trade war between the two countries could undermine the global trade order and deal a massive blow to the world economy. The U.S.-China trade war will also hurt both countries. China's global trade war is heavily dependent on the U.S. Last year, the U.S. accounted for 18.9% of China's total exports and 65% of China's total global trade surplus. In addition, it is critical for Beijing to maintain friendly relations with Washington to advance its industrial structure and foster high-tech industries. Meanwhile, the U.S. farming sector increasingly relies on China, which is the second largest importer of U.S. agricultural products after Canada. U.S. agricultural exports to China, including soybeans and corns, have tripled in value since 2000. China's ban on high tariffs on U.S. agricultural products would pose a serious threat to U.S. farmers. We hear from a U.S. expert about the potential causes of the U.S.-China trade disputes that could translate into a global trade war.
Okay, and now to broaden the perspective on this issue, we have Dr. JeffreyJ.Schott on the line, who is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Hi, Jeff.
Okay.
What is the public sentiment in the U.S. right now regarding this trade dispute between Washington and Beijing?
There's a lot of concern in the United States about the large imbalance in U.S. trade, but also a lot of concern about the approach that the Trump administration has taken to trying to negotiate a resolution to our problems. The basic problem that has been the subject of a trade dispute is the forced transfer of technology and the misappropriation of intellectual property. That was the subject of an extensive investigation under Section 301 of U.S. trade law, and has resulted in the recommendation that unless China changes its domestic policies, that the United States would retaliate on $50 billion of Chinese imports into the United States. The concern in the public is that the Chinese would match us dollar for dollar and retaliate against U.S. shipments to China, and that would affect major farm goods, automobiles, and aircraft. And so those major U.S. export industries are concerned that they will be caught in the crossfire of a trade dispute.
And so you just mentioned about those major U.S. export industries. So you're referring to mostly the tech sector, or is it different for each other sectors?
Well, the problem is mostly in the tech sector. But in threatening retaliation, we're getting to what is traded now. And for China, they buy a lot of U.S. farm goods, soybeans. They buy a lot of U.S. cars, and they buy U.S. aircraft. And that accounts for most of the $45 billion in retaliation that they have threatened to impose on U.S. shipments to China.
So going back a little bit, President Trump in spring tweeted that trade war is good and it's actually easy to win. So why did he really say this? What does he mean by this?
Well, he's getting some bad advice and he has some bad instincts. That's clear. Basically, no one wins from a trade war. Everyone is worse off. One party to the dispute may be relatively worse off than the other, but nobody wins. And if we have retaliation, as we already have to a small extent on steel, because China is already retaliating on $3 billion of U.S. shipments in the steel dispute, we lose. And prices go up, less opportunity to export. Now, what I assume President Trump means is that we are running a large trade deficit, and therefore we can attack more imports to the United States than China can attack imports to China from the United States. The United States last year imported over $500 billion of merchandise from China. China only bought about $130 billion from the United States. And so that's why when President Trump initially said $50 billion retaliations, and China matched it, Trump said, well, we'll go another 100, up the ante. And China doesn't have another $100 billion of U.S. merchandise to hit because it doesn't buy that much from the United States. So in that very simplistic worldview, which is devoid of economic logic, he thinks that he can win a trade war. But everyone else knows that we're going to be losers from a trade war, and it can only hurt the American consumer and American companies and workers.
Okay, and Professor Shin, what do you think about Jeff's idea?
Well, I agree in his point asserting that in the trade disputes between the two countries, nobody wins. Everybody is losing that. And he warns that the idea that Trump is so kind of confident about winning the war rests upon the hypothesis that America is importing a lot more, about 3 times more than what China is importing from the United States. But he has to remember that even though the size of the imports of China is about 1/3, if China reduces the import from America, like soybeans, aircrafts, or kind of automobile, there will be a certain proportion of the American manufacturers and the people who's going to lose their jobs, who's going to lose their income. So I think he points out that it is better off for them, 2 countries, to settle the matter as quick as possible. And in order to do that, I think China has to implement a little quicker remedies, in satisfying the demands of United States government.
Jeff, Professor Shin here just told us that China also has to take measures.
Essentially, this is not likely to happen all at once. There may be some minor actions taken and incremental increases in the retaliation to show resolve. But I think what we've already seen is that some U.S. farmers are already losing sales. China has hit over $1 billion of aluminum scrap exports from the United States. And if we go another step further, which President Trump has threatened after June 15th, that could lead to substantial cutbacks in Chinese purchases of U.S. soybeans, U.S. automobiles, and U.S. aircraft. And they would just divert their purchases to other suppliers from other countries.
Going back again to the Section 301, we want to know a little more about this Section 301. What is this really telling us to do?
Well, Section 301 of U.S. trade law has been around for a long time. And it was used prior to the establishment of the World Trade Organization for the U.S. to bring cases in the old General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade against foreign countries that pursue unfair trade practices. So it was a way for us to bring a dispute and retaliate if our trading partner was essentially subsidizing or otherwise dealing unfairly with U.S. goods. Under the WTO, Section 301 has rarely been used because it essentially is just a channel for bringing disputes to the WTO, where the adjudication, where the dispute settlement process proceeds. Now, the problem with the Chinese technology transfer intellectual property case is that most of the concerns that U.S. companies have and the U.S. government has are not covered by WTO obligations. There's only one small part of the complaint that is subject to a WTO obligation, and that is being litigated in the WTO. And that litigation takes quite some time, more than a year, sometimes more than 2 years. But the other issues, misappropriation of intellectual property, those types of provisions are not covered by existing WTO obligations. And therefore, the United States is using its domestic legislation to pursue remedies. Now, that's fine until you get to the point where you seek to retaliate. If you retaliate in areas that are covered by WTO obligations, that's illegal under the WTO because you need to have authorization first from the WTO before you can retaliate. So all of these proposed actions that the United States is taking or threatening against foreign countries essentially violate its U.S. WTO obligations. The Chinese counter-retaliation is also a violation. So this is not doing any good for the vitality and the credibility of the rules-based multilateral trading system. And Korea and many other countries are going to be hurt as a result of this ongoing dispute, which is not being pursued under the established rules of the WTO.
And now, of course, we know that you are an expert based in the States, but we would like to ask you what Beijing is going to do next with this retaliatory tariffs and trade tensions between the two superpowers. What do you think Beijing will do?
Well, first thing to say is I don't speak for the U.S. government, and for sure I don't speak for the Chinese government. So this is just my thoughts of what China might do. I think China, as was evident in the trade talks last weekend in Beijing between Vice Premier Liu He and Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, I think the Chinese still want the type of trade deal that they were talking about in Washington a few weeks ago that got disrupted when President Trump tweeted that he was still going to move forward with trade retaliation against China. That type of deal talks about increases in specific products, so Chinese buying more U.S. agricultural goods, or automobiles, or airplanes perhaps, just the very same goods that they will buy less of if retaliation actually takes place. And to deal with the fundamental problems of technology transfer and intellectual property through an incremental reform in Chinese policies over an extended period of time. That probably is too incremental, too slow, and too uncertain for U.S. officials. Indeed, that's not just the Trump administration. U.S. officials in previous administrations have also been leery of a deal with China that takes so long to work out. That's why the negotiations of a bilateral investment treaty with China and the United States never really reached its conclusion, even though talks have been going on for almost 10 years.
Thank you, Jeff, for your insights.
Thank you, Sandy. Bye-bye.
And now, Professor Shin, so what do you think about what Jeff just said about Beijing's counteractions to Washington? What do you think Washington really wants from Beijing?
I think by their kind of a series of talks and discussions between the two governments, I think China now fully understands what is real intention, what is real motivation between the Trump administration's kind of a very apparently strong stance against the Chinese trade surplus. So I think China will understand that in order to settle the problem as soon as possible, I think China will be coming up with kind of some kind of a measure, a very drastic measure to satisfy the American government. And by doing so, I think America and China will be able to kind of close down the trade issue. I think by the end of November, I think they'll be better off, for both countries to settle the matter as soon as possible.
Right. So anything else you want to add on to what Jeff just told us?
Well, China is one of the most important trading partners for Korea, and if China has a trouble with the United States in trade issues, it's going to have a direct effect upon Korean, economy and Korean export. And I think China and the United States is smart enough, to not to kind of expand the issue on a global kind of a war. So I'm hopeful that United States and China will come up with a kind of very satisfactory resolution regarding this trade disputes. Of course, there will be kind of disputes on and on in the future because that has been the solve from the last century. So I think, but the initial issue dispute that Trump has raised since he took office in January last year, I think that issue will come down, and that will go into a second phase of the Trump administration by the early next year.
Hoping that this tension would not intensify anymore. Just one last question. So what is this tension going to impact on the South Korean economy? Do you think, is this only bad news for the South Korean economy, or do we have a chance to actually do better between this dispute?
Assuming that China and America has to come up with a certain kind of a mutually acceptable agreements, definitely that's going to have a substantial potential effect upon Chinese export to United States, definitely. And if that's so, Korean exports to China will be affected on the second degree. So our kind of export in the economic growth will be a little bit dampened, but as not as significant as making Korean economy to running into recession. So we have to adapt to it, and we have full capability to adapt to a kind of change in trade environment. So we should not be afraid about very global kind of trade war between the two powers. And it's another kind of a shock, but we will be successfully get over the trouble by the end of this year. I'm pretty hopeful about that.
Right. Thank you so much for your good advice for resolving this dispute, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Looks like it's time for us to wrap things up. This has been Cha Sang-mi for The Point World Affairs. Join us next week when we tackle another hot topic that's grabbing the attention of the world. We'll once again turn to various experts from Korea and around the world for their different perspectives. Thank you for watching.